Hi, welcome back to Pin Cut Sew. My name is Nikki, and today we're going to talk about how to make quilting cost less. I put out a poll to my Instagram followers the other day, and I was asking if people think that quilting is a very expensive hobby, and more than 90% of people said yes, quilting is expensive. So, as a frugal person myself, I have some great tips for how to make quilting a little bit cheaper and not quite so expensive. So we're gonna get right into it. Okay, number one, right off the bat, be thou not influenced. This is the best thing you can do for yourself. If you want to make quilting cheaper and you're feeling like it's expensive, it might be because the people you follow on Instagram and YouTube or Pinterest or whatever are quilting with very nice fabrics. They're getting all the new materials. They have very fancy machines. They spare no expense when it comes to making quilts. You have to realize that those people, the most popular quilting influencers, are probably designers of fabric, so they have those designer companies to work with. They're being gifted a lot of fabric. They're using their own fabrics. They're not just quilting hobbyists. They are likely in the quilting business, and so that means they have the resources to expend on quilting that you might not. So, if this is a problem for you, if you're following these people and it makes you want more, it makes you think that what you have is not enough, you need to unfollow those influencers. And I know that those people, because people in the sewing and quilting community are so kind and so nice, they would want you to unfollow them if this is breeding a sense of discontent in you. So go look for hashtags like frugal quilting, scrap quilter, things like that, that you might find more influential quilters on the more frugal side of things. So if it's a problem for you, if the reason you feel like quilting is unobtainable because of the cost is because you see all these people making fancy quilts where money is no object and they're always ordering new fabrics and they're sparing no expense with making big quilts all the time, then it's just time to readjust your social media habits. Social media used to be, I think, a lot more easy to curate for yourself, but just as an experiment last night, I went on my Instagram feed and I sort of counted like how much of my feed was people I follow and how much was an ad or a suggested post to follow, and it was half. It was half. I would see like one or two of people that I follow, photos or reels, and then the next one would be an ad, and then the next one would be a suggested post, and then one more of someone I follow, and then another ad, suggested post. So Instagram kind of makes it hard nowadays for you to really curate your feed, but just be really aware of how it's breeding discontentment in you if it is. Okay, number two, let's move on. You can think more scrappy with your quilting. So once you get away from the influencer quilters on Instagram and other places, you can start to realize how much quilting you can do with the fabric you already have on hand. If you start to retrain your mind instead of seeing things that all are matchy-matchy in fabric collections and start learning to put together fabrics yourself, sometimes you'll come up with some of the best things that you never would have if you were just ordering already put together fat quarter packs or jelly rolls or anything like that. So you can even make a quilt out of just two fabrics like I did with that gingham baby quilt. Three fabrics. You can make the best scrap quilts. Some of my favorite projects have been because I was forced out of necessity to just use what I had because I couldn't run to the store or whatever. Like if I'm making a shirt and I have to make a binding out of a different fabric, that ends up being my favorite part. This can breed a lot of creativity in you if you just train yourself to use what you have and think about it more creatively. So open up your drawer, see what fabrics you have, and just when you're searching for quilt ideas, keep your search more scrappy. Okay, which brings me to my third point. You actually do not need to purchase quilt patterns. Although so many designers make the best patterns, like Susie Quilts, for example, such good patterns. There's tons of them out there. But a lot of times, if you look carefully at a quilt pattern, it really is just a basic block. And if you just study it for a minute, you can probably figure out how it's put together without actually purchasing the pattern. Because the basics of quilt putting togethering are all the same. The quilt sandwich, the binding, the cutting, and everything are the same. You don't need instructions for that. So if you can just look at the quilt top and figure out how that's made, you can be inspired to make your own thing. And all you really need is like one basic pattern book or a couple of YouTube videos. Like recently, I just saw someone selling a pattern for a quilt, and it was really beautiful, but it was just an Ohio Star, which is a very basic quilt block, Ohio Star pattern. And it was creative the way that she used like a print sashing and all solids for the stars, but you really don't need to purchase a pattern for that if you can't afford to. Yes, you can support small business by purchasing those things. I know I appreciate when people buy my patterns from my shop. That's great, but if you're struggling with the cost of quilting, try looking at those quilts you're inspired by and seeing if maybe you can put those together without purchasing a pattern. I have this one quilt book that I got at a used bookstore, and it was made in the 90s. It has every quilt block imaginable from basic to advanced. And there are other quilt books that just have like the very basic ones, like the Ohio Star, a log cabin, courthouse steps, 9-patch, those kinds of very basic things. And a lot of times these quilt patterns are just reimagining those very basic old quilt blocks. Okay, number 4, you actually don't have to make only big quilts in order to be a quilter. I know this is true because I have made countless non-quilt quilt projects. People don't quilt because they want quilts around their house. I mean, they do want quilts around their house, but that's really not why you're doing it. You can go buy quilts if that's all you want. You're doing it because you enjoy the process. So quilting small things like mini quilts, tote bags, there's so many it's hard to list. I actually have a whole blog post about tons of things you can quilt that aren't big quilts, and it's one of my most popular ones. So I know people are looking for these projects, like my journal covers. You can quilt a laptop case. I have quilted coasters, quilted pot holders, quilted pencil pouches. There's just so many things that can scratch that quilting itch without you having to make a whole big quilt. So if you can't afford the backing and the batting, make something small instead. And if you just want to make one quilt block like I did recently out of this Judy Martin book, now I can turn it into a pillow or a tote or whatever, or I might just keep it up there because it's pretty. But I also like to just make single quilt blocks and make pouches out of them, or make tote bags out of them, or whatever, because I don't always have time to make intricate quilt blocks into an entire quilt. So small quilt projects, I love to make mini quilts. You don't necessarily need to plan large quilt projects in order to be considered a quilter. Also, it's a great way to learn too, because the process for making a small quilt is the exact same as making a giant quilt. The batting, the backing, it's all the same. Okay, next, I also asked on that Instagram poll for people to send me their best tips for frugal quilting, and the one I got the most was something that I also do and I always have, is that people like to thrift sheets. If you go to the thrift store and you look for cotton, especially sheets, make sure it's cotton. Flannel is okay too, but you don't want polyester in your quilting. So look for cotton, all cotton sheets. A lot of times you can find vintage ones or really beautiful ones. Target has a line of all cotton sheets. You know how Target sheets comes in those bags? I always keep those bags because they're all cotton. They're nice fabric. So when I go thrifting, I always look through the whole linens section just to see if there's anything I can use in there, especially when it comes to quilt backing or sashing, anything. Like if you find a white cotton sheet, that's gold for quilting. You can use that for an entire sashing, for your sashing on a whole quilt. So other things you can do are use clothing. You can find a lot of great men's shirts that are all cotton. You can make a plaid quilt. You can use jeans. I have a whole quilt, my picnic quilt I've made out of jeans many years ago. I made it out of jeans. I made it out of vintage linens that were my husband's grandmother's, that were like tea towels, and then I backed it with a cotton. At Urban Outfitters you can get tapestries, and I got one on clearance one day, and so I used that for the back. We've been using this picnic quilt for decades now, I think. So you can get really creative with fabrics. Just find cotton things, raid your giveaway bins before you take them to Goodwill. See if you can cut anything up. Use your dad's cast off shirts. You can find some really great plaids and filler prints in old shirts like that. I also really love to look at the clothing section, especially the skirts that might have large swaths of like linen. I always find really interesting colors of linen in the dresses and skirt section at the thrift store. And I really like to quilt with linen. I think it's so beautiful. It adds a lot of good texture, so that's a good tip too. Okay, lastly, number 6. The batting and the backing can be some of the more expensive aspects of making a quilt. So in order to make this cost a little bit less, there's a few things you can do. For the backing, always get it on sale. Hobby Lobby and Joann's puts batting on sale all the time. I get the cotton batting, always get it 50% off. But then if you buy it bigger than the quilt you're making, you can use what's left, even if the part that's left isn't big enough to back another quilt with, you can actually piece batting together. I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, all you have to do to join two quilt batting pieces together is make sure the edges are straight, butt them up against each other, and I have my machine set on a zigzag stitch. I'm using black thread so you'll be able to see as my example. And you just zigzag them together, kind of butting them up against each other as you go. So now my batting pieces are joined, and once these are inside of a quilt and it's all quilted on top, these will not be coming apart. So this is a great way to make your batting just go a little bit farther. So if you're making a twin size quilt and you buy a king size batting, then you can use what's left to piece it together and make backing for another row size or twin size quilt. For backing, you have some options too. I've backed quilts with cotton sheets from the thrift store. I've also pieced together backings, and I like to do that because it makes it more interesting on the back. I've been given and gifted some large pieces of fabric that really work well for backing. You can also shop the thrift store. There's a lot of times there's big pieces of prints there. Just make sure they're all cotton. I've lived in so many states now, but one of my states had a really great fabric section at the thrift store, and it was all hanging up, and I used to find a lot of good things there. If you are going to use a sheet, the thread count can really affect things. Like I backed a quilt once with an Eddie Bauer sheet that was all cotton, but it was really dense. It was a really high quality sheet. Like, I guess the thread count was like really high, so it was kind of hard for my needle to get through it, so be aware of that. I mean, it worked out fine, but it's definitely more of like a crisp quilt backing, not as soft as I maybe would have chosen, but I still really like it. So those are my tips. I have one bonus tip for you. The absolutely most frugal way that you can quilt is to just quilt by hand. Sewing doesn't actually require very many materials at all if you really think about it. I have had some people reach out to me on Etsy asking if they could make some of my projects by hand, and absolutely you can. I mean, what did people do before we had sewing machines, right? They quilted things by hand. So if you don't even have a sewing machine or anything that can quilt, then start quilting by hand. It's fun, it's relaxing, and it's actually a lot faster than you might think it is. People probably think you spend like months and years to make one quilt, but you really don't. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty quick. If you do quilt by machine, I would say the only thing you absolutely need is the walking foot. I have a whole video on why you need a walking foot for quilting, how to use it, what it's for. If you've had trouble with quilting because you have all your fabrics bunching up together when you're trying to do the top stitching, the actual quilting part, watch my walking foot video because that's going to solve all your problems. Okay, so if you have more tips for frugal quilting, how to make sewing and quilting a little bit less expensive, please chime in the comments and hit like if you like this video. And I will see you all soon. Oh, I forgot. I recently, in the spirit of frugal quilting, I recently ordered a Moda scrap bag from Amazon. You can get one for $18, but you can actually get three for I think $38, which is a better price. But it's very cool because Moda, which is a fancy designer fabric company, puts together, it's basically like a jelly roll. And this is the second one I bought because I liked them so much. This is a sewing themed collection of fabrics. Can you see it? Is it focusing? And so I think I paid $18 for this. A jelly roll costs quite a bit more than that. They're not perfect. A lot of them will have selvages. These ones actually don't, but the first ones did. And so the first time I ordered it, I was just going in blind. I thought there'd be like a lot of mismatched fabrics, but I love that they're an entire collection of fabrics, and I was able to make a whole baby quilt top. I'll show you. Out of these beautiful prints that they sent me. So this is what I made. Next week I'm going to have a tutorial for this if you guys are interested. And I'll quilt it and I'll put it up on my Etsy shop. But isn't it cute? So this was a good way if you do like the matchy look, if you don't have very many scraps or fabrics, or if you don't really know how to put scraps together, this was actually a frugal way to do it. So I'll link these little Moda scrap bags in the description because I thought it was really fun, and I just love to get surprises in the mail. So yeah, chime in with your frugal quilting tips, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.